December 3rd, 2020, an executive at Pfizer's headquarters in New York stared at a spreadsheet that contained a number he could not change. The company had spent months promising the world 100 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine before the end of the year, and the entire machinery of global public health had been built around that promise. Governments had placed orders. Distribution networks had been activated. Armies had been mobilized to transport vials at temperatures far below freezing, and now a single line on a spreadsheet had turned that promise into a gamble. The line read simply, cationic lipid, not enough of it, and there was no backup source. The number was not subtle. Pfizer needed a specific kind of fat molecule called a cationic lipid to wrap the fragile messenger RNA inside a protective nanoparticle. Without that lipid, the vaccine could not exist, no matter how many factories Pfizer built or how many filling lines it installed. And as of December 3rd, virtually every gram of that lipid produced anywhere in the world was already being shipped straight into Pfizer's manufacturing facilities. There was no warehouse, no reserve, no stockpile, just a just-in-time pipeline that could snap the moment one supplier's production hiccuped. And hiccups in the pharmaceutical supply chain are not rare. They are the rule. You have watched a tightly woven plan begin to unravel over a single missing piece, and you know the cold feeling that comes with it. The moment when the spreadsheet shows a number that does not match the promise. The moment when the scale of the problem dwarfs the plan you trusted. Pfizer was about to learn what every trader who has ever watched a position go against them knows. The structure that looks unbreakable usually breaks at the one point you thought was boring. The cationic lipid was boring. Nobody in the executive suite had ever worried about fat molecules, and that indifference nearly cost the world its best shot at ending the pandemic. To understand why Pfizer's supply chain almost collapsed, you have to look at what a cationic lipid actually does inside a vaccine. It is not the active ingredient. It is not the code. It is the delivery vehicle, the microscopic truck that carries the genetic payload into human cells. And before COVID-19, nobody had ever tried to make billions of those trucks in a single year. The process for creating lipid nanoparticles at scale simply did not exist. As Prashant Yadav, a supply chain expert quoted by the National Institutes of Health, put it bluntly, "We have not invented a process for doing lipid nanoparticles at scale." The entire global pharmaceutical industry had been producing tiny amounts of these molecules for small-scale clinical trials. Scaling that up by a factor of 1,000 in the middle of a pandemic with no existing factories was not a challenge. It was a chasm. And here is where the crack becomes a fracture. Pfizer had not built its own supply of cationic lipids from the start. It relied on a small number of external suppliers, most of them in Europe, who had never produced at pandemic volume either. When Pfizer asked them to ramp up, the suppliers faced the same problem Pfizer faced. The raw materials for the raw materials were also scarce, and the purification steps required extreme precision. A single contamination event in any of those suppliers' facilities could halt production for weeks, and Pfizer at that point had no alternative source. The company had bet everything on a handful of suppliers, and those suppliers had bet everything on a chain of molecules that nobody had ever needed before. You can see the pattern because you have seen it before. It is the same pattern that breaks leveraged positions, supply chains, and entire economies. Concentration disguised as efficiency. Pfizer had optimized its supply chain for maximum efficiency by relying on a few highly specialized suppliers. That is rational on paper. It is catastrophic when anything goes wrong, and something did go wrong, as it always does. By early December of 2020, Pfizer had to cut its near-term vaccine rollout target from 100 million doses to just 50 million. The company said nothing publicly about the cationic lipid at first, but the Wall Street Journal reported that the bottleneck was raw material supply, not factory capacity. The infrastructure was fine. The fat molecules were not. You just watched an institution worth hundreds of billions get cut in half by a molecule most people cannot name. That is the kind of failure that creates opportunity for those who see the pattern before the crowd does. If you want to keep seeing these cracks in the system, the exact points where concentration collapses into inefficiency, subscribe to this channel and drop the word cationic lipid in the comments if you caught how the same trap shows up in your own trades. This is the first layer of the descent. The institution, with all its resources, all its scientists, all its government support, was felled by a molecule most people have never heard of. But the deeper question is not what the molecule was. The deeper question is why nobody planned for its scarcity. And the answer to that question reveals something about how institutions think and how they fail. They optimize for the world as it is, not for the world as it could become. They model the most likely scenarios and ignore the improbable ones, because improbable events, by definition, do not happen often enough to justify the cost of preparing for them. Except that in a global pandemic, improbable events do not stay improbable for long. They cascade. Now consider what Pfizer actually needed. The company said its vaccine depended on 280 different materials or components produced by suppliers in 19 different countries. That is not a few dozen dependencies. That is a web, and any one of those 280 inputs could break the entire chain. But the cationic lipid was special because it was not a commodity that could be bought on an open market. It was a highly specialized molecule produced by a tiny number of companies, each with custom equipment and proprietary processes. You could not just call a different chemical distributor and order more. There was no more. The entire global output of the specific cationic lipid Pfizer needed was already flowing into its factories. And that output was not enough. When you think about it, the real bottleneck was not the molecule itself. It was the assumption that a molecule of such specificity could be scaled quickly. That assumption was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that the institution could not see until it was too late. This is the same blind spot that kills $100 million trading strategies, single supplier manufacturing lines, and carefully planned military operations. The assumption that the future will resemble the past, and that past optimization is future-proof. It is not. And the moment a pandemic or a market dislocation hits, every unexamined assumption becomes a liability. But here's the part that goes deeper. Pfizer was not operating in a vacuum. The entire global vaccine effort was built on similar assumptions. AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, all of them faced their own supply chain bottlenecks. Glass vials, sterile filters, the specialized plastic bags used in bioreactors. Each of these inputs was produced by a small number of specialized suppliers. The entire world's hope of ending a pandemic was resting on a handful of factories making glass and plastic and fat molecules. And the only reason it did not collapse entirely is that a few institutions and a few individuals started asking the question nobody had asked before. What if our assumptions are wrong? Pfizer eventually found a solution, but it was not elegant. The company decided to build its own cationic lipid production capacity, developing its own manufacturing process to control the supply of that critical raw material. That decision, taken in the middle of a pandemic, was a confession. It was the institution admitting that its original model had a fatal blind spot. The market could not supply enough of a molecule the company's entire vaccine depended on. The only way to fix it was to become its own supplier, to insource a capability it had assumed would always be available externally. The assumption was not just wrong, it was almost disastrously wrong, and that is the paradox that should hold your attention. The vaccine science was brilliant. The clinical trials were rigorous. The manufacturing scale-up was heroic. But the entire endeavor nearly collapsed, not because of science, but because of a supply chain dependency that nobody had stress-tested. The molecule was not the threat. The belief that no single point could fail was the threat. And that belief is alive and well in every other complex system you interact with, from the food supply to the energy grid to the financial market you operate in. The same blind spot that nearly broke the vaccine program is embedded in the structure of the world around you. You have felt this blind spot before. You have watched a carefully researched trade position disintegrate because of a liquidity event nobody predicted. You have watched a portfolio built on diversification assumptions suddenly correlate in a way that broke every hedge. You have watched an algorithm you trusted fail in a market condition it was never trained on. And in each of those moments, you realized that the model was not wrong in a small way. It was wrong in a fundamental way. It assumed the world would behave like it always had. The world did not cooperate. What happened inside Pfizer in the fourth quarter of 2020 is a case study in institutional fragility. A company that had spent decades perfecting its supply chain discovered that perfection in a crisis is just a synonym for brittleness. The more efficient the chain, the fewer the redundancy, the fewer the bottlenecks that could fail, and the more catastrophic each failure becomes. Pfizer's cationic lipid bottleneck was not a surprise in retrospect. It was inevitable, given the assumptions the company had made. And the lesson is not about vaccine supply chains alone. The lesson is about the hidden dependencies that exist in every system you rely on, the single supplier you never questioned, the indicator you never back-tested against a black swan event, the strategy that works until the market changes its structure, the assumption that someone else is managing the margin of safety. Pfizer had assumed that the market for specialized lipids would expand to meet pandemic demand because it always had expanded before. But the market had never faced a pandemic before. The model had no data for this scenario. And when the data arrived, the model broke. You just watched a model break because the data it needed never existed. And that same hidden dependency is sitting in your own strategy, silent until the black swan arrives. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering exactly where institutional fragility hides in the systems you trust, because the next break is already forming. Drop hidden dependency in the comments if this shifted how you see your own assumptions. Now consider what happened after the break. Pfizer did not collapse. It adapted. It built its own lipid production capacity. It invested in redundancy. It accepted the cost of insourcing a capability it had previously outsourced. But the adaptation came only after the break. The institution had to feel the pain of the shortage before it could change its structure. And that pattern, too, is universal. You do not diversify a position until after the margin call. You do not add redundancy until after the outage. You do not question your assumptions until after they fail. The pain comes first. The learning comes second. And the only question is whether the break is small enough to survive. The world came closer than most people realized to a vaccine shortage that would have prolonged the pandemic by months, possibly longer. The shortage did not happen because Pfizer found a workaround just in time. But the margin was thin, the workaround was expensive, and the vulnerability remains embedded in similar supply chains across dozens of industries. Every critical medical product, every semiconductor, every rare earth mineral that powers the technology you depend on, each of them rests on a handful of producers in a handful of countries. The same logic that nearly broke the vaccine program is still in place, unchanged, waiting for the next shock. You now understand something most people do not. The raw material was never the threat. The threat was the belief that one source was enough. And that belief is not a technical problem. It is not a logistical problem. It is a cognitive problem. It lives in the structure of how decisions are made, how risks are assessed, and how certainty is constructed. The institutions that run the world do not know their own blind spots until the blind spots become visible in a crisis. And at that point, it is often too late to avoid the consequences. The next time you see a plan that looks efficient, ask yourself what is not being said. The antibody injections that were also made with lipid nanoparticles, the glass vials that were only manufactured by 2 companies, the filters that were produced in a single factory in a single country. Each of them is a bet on continuity. Each of them assumes that nothing will break. And each of them is wrong in exactly the same way Pfizer was wrong in December of 2020. The question that haunts the vaccine story is not whether Pfizer could have done better. It is whether other unseen dependencies are waiting to snap right now in plain sight across the systems you trust every single day. And the only answer is yes. The only difference is whether you are looking at the right spreadsheet. The spreadsheet you need to examine is not Pfizer's. It is the invisible spreadsheet that describes every complex system you interact with, from the electricity grid to the financial markets clearinghouse, and it contains the same number, a single dependency percentage that nobody has calculated, because calculating it would force you to admit that the entire structure is one failure away from collapse. The cationic lipid story is not a historical footnote from 2020. It is a template, and once you learn to read that template, you cannot unsee it. Let's look at another sheet in that invisible spreadsheet, one that does not involve biology at all. In March of 2020, as the pandemic shuttered economies, the market for U.S. Treasury bonds, the most liquid financial instrument on the planet, seized up. The bid-ask spread on 10-year notes widened from less than 1 basis point to over 30 basis points in a matter of days. The mechanism that was supposed to handle any volume of trading simply stopped working. And the reason, when you strip away the jargon, was the same as Pfizer's problem. The market had been optimized for efficiency, which meant every participant had been relying on the same small set of high-frequency trading firms to provide liquidity. Those firms, facing their own constraints, pulled back simultaneously, and suddenly the most important bond market in the world was running on fumes. That is the hidden pattern. The move toward efficiency concentrates risk into fewer and fewer nodes, and then something that was never modeled as a failure point takes down the whole system. In the Treasury market, the concentration was in a handful of algorithms that all operated on the same logic. When the logic failed for one, it failed for all. The Federal Reserve had to step in with a $1 trillion intervention to restore basic function. The intervention worked, but only because the Fed possessed a tool that no institution in the vaccine supply chain had: the ability to create money out of thin air. Pfizer could not print cationic lipids, and in most real-world systems, there is no central bank waiting to buy your crisis. You have experienced this yourself in smaller ways. Every time a strategy that worked perfectly in backtesting disintegrated in live markets. The backtest assumed you could exit a position at the quoted price. The live market showed you that the quoted price was an illusion when everyone else was trying to exit the same position. That gap between the model and reality is the same gap that nearly swallowed Pfizer's vaccine program. The model assumed supply would be available. The reality was that supply was a single contamination event away from zero. The model assumed liquidity would be there. The reality was that liquidity is always there until you need it most. And here is where the forensic trail leads to something even more uncomfortable. Pfizer eventually admitted the shortage publicly when it announced the revised dosage target in December of 2020. But the shortage itself had been building for months. The company's internal supply chain team had flagged the risk of a cationic lipid bottleneck as early as August of that year, according to reports published in industry journals. That means the institution knew it had a problem 4 months before the problem became public. And for 4 months, the company's leadership operated under the assumption that the problem would resolve itself. The market would produce more lipid, a new supplier would emerge. The bottleneck was a temporary friction, not a structural vulnerability. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. That 4-month gap between knowledge and action is the real disaster. It is the space where the cost of a problem multiplies because the people who could fix it do not believe the problem is real. They have too much invested in the narrative that everything is under control. They have too many spreadsheets that assume continuity, and so they wait, hoping that the world will validate their assumptions until the spreadsheet forces them to see that the world has already made a different decision. You have watched this happen in your own decisions. In the trade you held too long because you could not admit the thesis was wrong. In the supply chain you did not diversify because it felt like an unnecessary expense. The waiting is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of nerve. Now take this understanding and apply it to a dimension of the vaccine story that is even more troubling. The cationic lipid shortage was only one of 280 dependencies. What about the other 279? Pfizer had to solve each of them, and at various points, each was a potential breaking point. The sterile filters used to purify the vaccine solution were only produced by a few companies. The specialized plastic bags used in the bioreactors where the drug substance is grown were also single-sourced. The glass vials into which the final product is filled came from a tiny number of manufacturers. Every single one of those inputs could have caused the same crisis as the lipid. And the only reason the lipid became the public bottleneck is that it was the first one that snapped. The deeper lesson is that any complex system designed for peak efficiency is guaranteed to have multiple unexamined single points of failure. You will not find them all. You cannot fortify them all. The only way to survive is to build a system that does not depend on any one point being perfect. That means building in redundancy, even when it is expensive. That means diversifying suppliers, even when it is inconvenient. That means accepting lower efficiency in exchange for higher resilience. And that trade-off, which seems obvious in hindsight, is almost never made in advance, because the cost of the redundancy is visible and immediate. The cost of the failure is invisible and deferred. And human institutions like human traders systematically prefer the invisible cost. This is the exact same insight you need to apply to your own edge. Every single point of failure in your trading system is a lipid shortage waiting to happen. Invisible right up until it breaks you, and by then it is too late. If you want to keep exposing the hidden faults in the systems that everyone else takes for granted, subscribe, because we are only getting started with what the algorithms do not want you to see. Now I want to know, what is the single point of failure you know exists in your own strategy but have not fixed yet? Drop it in the comments below. Consider the numbers from a broader perspective. Pfizer's total revenue in 2020 was over $41 billion. The company had access to tens of billions in government funding for vaccine development and manufacturing. It had the full attention of the most powerful governments on Earth, and yet it almost failed because it did not have a plan B for a fat molecule. If the most well-resourced organization in the world can be brought to the edge of collapse by a single molecular component, what does that imply for systems that operate with far fewer resources and far less attention? The answer is not comfortable. It suggests that the systems you rely on most, the ones that function smoothly every day, are held together by assumptions that are as fragile as the ones that almost broke Pfizer. Look at the semiconductor industry, for example. Every advanced chip in the world depends on extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, each of which is produced by exactly one company, ASML, based in the Netherlands. A single factory fire, a single export restriction, a single supply chain disruption at ASML, and the entire global chip supply chain begins to unravel. The machines are produced at a rate of about 40 per year, and the lead time for each is longer than 18 months. There is no plan B, there is no alternative source. The entire technological civilization of the 21st century is resting on the production schedule of a single company in a single country. And most people do not know that company exists. That is the same ignorance that protected Pfizer's executives from worrying about cationic lipids. It is the comforting assumption that someone else is managing the risk, that the system has been designed to absorb shocks, that the improbable events will not happen. And it is exactly that ignorance that makes the system so brittle. The normalization of a single point of failure is the silence that precedes every major collapse. The question is not whether the next one will come. The question is whether you will be looking at the right spreadsheet when it does. You have already seen the shape of this failure in your own domain, the market indicator that everyone used and everyone assumed everyone else was using, until the moment it stopped working and everyone tried to exit through the same door. The cryptocurrency exchange that handled a volume larger than most nations' GDP, built on code maintained by a team of fewer than 100 people. The decentralized finance protocol whose total value locked depended on a single oracle feed that could be manipulated by a single transaction. In each case, the structure was celebrated for its efficiency and its innovation, and in each case, the fragility was invisible until the moment of rupture. The structure did not break because it was poorly designed. It broke because it was designed for a world that did not include its own failure. What Pfizer's story reveals is not a villain and not a hero. It is a structure that concentrates risk into a small number of highly optimized nodes and then pretends those nodes are infinitely reliable. The structure is not the result of malice. It is the result of cognitive convenience. It is easier to assume continuity than to calculate the cost of a break. It is easier to trust the supplier you have used for years than to qualify a new one. It is easier to build a model that assumes the past will repeat than to include scenarios that have never happened. And every one of those easier choices accumulates into a system that is simultaneously brilliant and one molecule away from silence. The spreadsheet that mattered in December 2020 was not the one that showed production capacity or distribution logistics. It was the one that showed a single number, the quantity of cationic lipid that could be produced in the next 30 days. That number and the assumptions behind it determined whether 100 million doses would materialize or vanish. The question for you, as you examine the systems you depend on, is whether you know what your equivalent of that number is. Not the indicator you hope will predict a move, the number that if it falls below a threshold means the system has already failed, and whether you are brave enough to look at that number before the crisis forces you to see it.